Why is this guy wearing a microwave for a helmet? What exactly is this mutant looking thing and why does its eggs grow roots? Welcome to Flareful February, a series of videos where I talk about the tabletop RPG I've been working on for the past couple of years. And today we're going to talk about the setting where this game takes place. The basic premise of this game is that in the year 2083, a massive solar flare hits Earth, and when I say massive, I mean it. If you have heard about the Carrington event where a bunch of telegraph poles started bursting into flames and arcing electricity back in 1859, that was the largest solar flare we have ever recorded in real life since we started recording solar flares. And it would be tiny in comparison to the one that happened in the fictional world of Flareful. The event that gave this game its name was so massive that it interfered with the planet itself and caused the magnetic poles to start flipping. Can this happen in real life? Probably not, which means instead of turning this into a whole Kurzgesagt video, I'm just going to add a little rule of cool counter in the corner. That's going to show you whenever there's a bit of pseudoscience, which is really useful when you're trying to create a game world where games can be had, even though we both know that this is the kind of thing that would probably give Neil deGrasse Tyson a panic attack. So, the poles of the Earth are flipping. What this means is that for the next 5 to 10,000 years, the Earth's magnetic shield, the one that protects us from the sun, is reduced to only about 10% of its normal strength. So remember that Carrington event I just mentioned, the biggest solar flare in history? Imagine if that happened every single day for the next 7,000 years. That is essentially the reality that the people of the world of Flareful are finding themselves living in. So what does a world like this look like for the people living in it? Well, the first thing is, most electronic devices are probably not working right. The day the flare happened, houses were catching on fire because of the electrical wires in the wall. Phones were exploding in people's pockets. Planes were falling from the sky. And with telephones and the internet both having shut down, it was basically impossible to coordinate a disaster response, or to keep up the supply chain to continue bringing food to your grocery stores. It was what scientists call a very bad day. You're playing 20 years later, but the effects are still there and the society within this fictional world hasn't recovered yet. Maybe it never will. Humanity is pretty much reduced to a bunch of small, self-governed survivor camps ranging from a few dozen people to a few hundreds, scattered all over the world but with no way of knowing what is happening beyond a 30-mile radius around them. The world is still filled with technology left behind by the people who lived here before the flare, but most of it either doesn't work or it still works but it's glitchy. Because to give you an idea, one of the weirdest things that happened during the Carrington event is that people unplugged the batteries powering their telegraphs, but they could continue sending messages back and forth even without a power source. So when exploring the Wasteland, don't be too surprised when an automatic door suddenly starts moving or a streetlight flickers on and off. Sometimes the lost tech of the Wasteland can feel a bit alive. Another important thing about the geomagnetic reversal is that people pretty much only go outside during the night, because if you get 10 times more UVs than usual from the sun, you can get sick very easily if you spend more than half an hour or so in the sunlight. This means most of your adventures in the world of Flareful are going to happen at night, and your characters will probably be resting during the day. You're going to be exploring this strange new world using torches, flashlights, or the headlights of your vehicles. But the night sky might look a bit different than what you might expect. This is because right now, Earth has about 12 South Poles and 17 North Poles. And yes, that's right, the counter did not tick for that one. And that means that wherever you are on the planet, auroras cover the night sky, like they normally only do at the poles, because technically you are probably pretty close to a pole. Now the cool thing about auroras is they don't just look pretty, they're also very useful, because the color of an aurora tells you how much solar wind there is right now. If the aurora is just blue or green, you're probably fine. You can go outside, fight some raiders, have some wholesome fun in the Wasteland. But if the aurora is multicolor and includes some pink or purple hues, you probably should find shelter. And that's because that second color, that's a higher layer of the atmosphere where the air is less dense. So if the solar wind is strong enough to make it visible, that means it's also strong enough to mess with you and make you sick. Another thing you might notice visually is that the plants have pretty much all turn red. That's a thing plants can do when exposed to radiation to better absorb ultraviolet light. In real life, this has happened to the forest around Chernobyl, for example, where the pine trees have turned into a red forest. But in the world of Flarefall, the plants are getting 10 times the amount of sunlight and cosmic rays that they usually get. So this is definitely not the kind of wasteland you'd see in Mad Max or New Vegas, with endless sand and not a plant in sight. It's more like The Last of Us or Horizon Zero Dawn, where cities are overgrown with creeping vines and giant trees. Here, nature is thriving. It's just you that isn't. And fun little world building fact, this guy, who is the illustration for the sniper archetype, is in fact wearing a forest camo suit right now. That's what they look like in this world. So hopefully this paints you a clearer picture of what the world looks like visually. But you can't run an adventure on visuals alone, right? So while this information is very useful for me to commission a bunch of art for this game, please subscribe, this was very expensive and I need ad revenue. What you need as a GM or as a player is probably adventure hooks. And in post-apocalyptic settings, hooks typically come in two forms: technology that existed before the apocalypse and that can still be found in the wasteland today, and factions that have been created since then by the survivors who had to adapt to this strange new world. Let's start with the technology. The flare happened in 2083, a couple decades in our future. This lets you introduce a couple pieces of sci-fi technology to turn our very boring world, where we don't even have dungeons, into one where adventures can be had. For example, let's talk about this thing. Before the flare, scientists at Chimera Corp were looking for a way to terraform the planet Mars. One way they experimented with was to manipulate DNA to create a new form of life, halfway between an animal and a plant. And this guy, he's the result. An ant whose exoskeleton has turned into tree bark, whose eggs grow tree roots, and who breathes in carbon dioxide and breathes out oxygen. The problem? When the flare hit, the electrical fences that were keeping these specimens inside their lab shut down. They broke containment, and these half plants were unleashed into a world with 10 times more sunlight than usual, or in other words, the perfect environment for them to thrive. So rather than colonizing Mars like they were intended to, they started colonizing good old planet Earth instead. So that's one thing survivors have to contend with now. A bunch of giant mutant lab animals, from ants to rats to monkeys, often extremely territorial and invasive. And some say that even though it was never made public, the government might have been doing some human experiments already. Another bit of pseudoscience that is very important to the setting is hardlight. The idea is that someone discovered that for a few microseconds, the light emitted by a fusion reaction becomes solid. Using this, people are able to create tangible holograms in various shapes. Imagine those old CRT TVs that recreate the same shape thousands of times per second, but instead of projecting it on a screen, it projects an actual physical shape, like an instantaneous 3D printer. The reason this is useful is that if you have a solid that gets recreated thousands of times per second, you have a building material that is virtually indestructible. If you damage something made of hardlight, the damaged part just decays into regular light and gets replaced within a few moments. So what can you do if you have an indestructible material? Well, you could create a hydraulic press that never breaks, no matter how much force you apply. Maybe even enough force to create a fusion reaction at room temperature. A fusion reaction, which in turn creates more hardlight, so it can be self-sustained. So now, instead of only being able to use hardlight near a nuclear power plant, you can have tiny cold fusion reactors and tiny hardlight projectors virtually anywhere. You can have billboards made of indestructible holograms, automatic doors that disappear in front of you, trains that create their own rails, and more. But that's just one use of this indestructible material. Another is to create really big things. Skyscrapers that can be multiple miles high, bridges over the sea, space elevators, cities at the bottom of the ocean. If there's a mega structure that we can't build in real life because we don't have a material strong enough, Hardlight can make it happen. And every one of those mega structures I just listed, they can be your dungeons for this game. But enough about the technology, what about the people? Well, the book is going to include a bunch of factions, but what you'll notice is that none of these factions have a canonical home base. My intention is that you should be able to set your campaign anywhere you want. So those factions are more ideas that can inspire you or that you can drop into your own adventures wherever your adventures happen to take place. The first faction is the perfect example of this. This is the Zenith, and before the flare it was a space station and a tourist resort, because if you have space elevators, you're probably gonna have space tourism. This is inevitable, sorry, it's just a thing that happens. The station was built and designed to withstand cosmic radiation, so when the flare hit, it was actually fine. The problem is, the shuttles that were meant to bring the tourists back to the surface never came, and every passenger and every staff member was stuck on board for the next 20 years. So they all worked together to turn the Zenith into a small, self-sufficient little community out in orbit, and it all worked well. But eventually, people started running out of spare parts to repair what was broken, and it became pretty clear that the only choice left was to deorbit the station. And so they did, and somehow they survived the crash landing. But what makes this faction interesting is that we have a bunch of people who have not seen how the world has evolved over the past 20 years. Wherever you decide to make them land, they're going to be fishes out of water who will be discovering this post-apocalyptic world at the same time as your players. So they fulfill a similar role to the Vaults and their dwellers in Fallout. Then we've got the Union. This is a faction that was formed by a bunch of blue-collar workers, the type of people who became extremely important after the flare, because they were the only ones with the practical skills to keep things running. If factions had stats, they're the ones who would have the highest luck. They were in the right place, at the right time, and with the right set of skills, so while everyone else was struggling to even just survive, they found opportunity in the Wasteland and became extremely wealthy. But that was 20 years ago. Today, most of the people who originally founded the Union have retired, and the faction is now being run by their kids. Kids who have inherited unimaginable wealth and power, and they don't always wield those very well. A lot of them behave like nouveau riche, with a lifestyle completely detached from the reality of most people out in the Wasteland. They collect sports cars, fancy clothes, the type of symbols of status that used to mean something but that don't really do that anymore. They often have problems, either because of corruption or incompetence, and when they have a problem, they just throw a bunch of money at mercenaries who will deal with the problem for them. So your players can either be the mercenaries working for the Union, or they can be the problem. And those are just two of the factions in the game. But there's going to be a bunch more when the game is done. There's the Collective, a faction that swears not to be a cult, but who sends people to every corner of the world so that they can spread the mission. There's Aegis, a bunch of super soldiers wearing armor made of plastic and ceramic, who try to gather as much metal as possible so that they can create a giant electromagnet so they can reboot the Earth's magnetic shield manually. Yeah, this one definitely deserves a bing. There's the Couriers, a bunch of urban explorers who make a living by delivering messages in a world without radio communication, and who take pride in knowing every shortcut and every secret passage in the Wasteland. There's Old Money, those businessmen who used to run the world before the flare, and who are now plotting in the shadows to rebuild the world as it used to be, because how it used to be was a world that benefited them. The Plot Twister's guide is not as far along as the rest of the game, but hopefully this video gives you a decent look into the kind of world Flarefall is about, and gives you some ideas for campaigns you'd like to run or characters you'd like to play. If you want to learn more about this game, there's a playlist down in the video description that will take you to all of the other videos about Flarefall that I've made. But I will see you in the next video, which is going to be about enemy design. Okay, bye!